Throughout the week, the absence of women's experiences and views has been mentioned in different ways. Historically, women's experience was not valued as highly as men's, and therefore records of it were either never written, or if they were written, they were often destroyed in later years. So women today are about a task similar, I think, to the one of this week, a task of reclaiming their history and asserting their perspectives as valuable and needed. Women have only been allowed to study theology formally in the second half of this century. Catherine of Siena and Teresa of Avila, recognized now as doctors of the Church, never attended theology classes, which is one reason why their writings are less systematic and formal. The older sisters in my own community, who had a love of theology and the ability for higher studies, were sent to Catholic University and other universities to obtain doctorates in Greek and Latin, their only entree into serious scholarships in patristics and scripture. The 20th century is vastly different than any of the preceding centuries, as we have different questions coming out of a different worldview. And women, whether by nature, nurture, which is a big debate, or societal position, frequently find themselves asking different questions than do men. Thankfully, we now have access to education and the critical tools available today. For my purposes here, I would like to mention three of these tools. In the area of language and text, and this is going to be very brief, as I see it and as the people who study language see it, there's an extreme importance of the language we speak in how we see our world. The language gives us parameters in which we can formally focus our thoughts. Now, we might have intuitive knowledge that's not languaged, that tends to push these parameters out. But how we can think is influenced by our language, and I only know how to read a few of the European languages, and I don't know how to pronounce them right because I've never been there. But even that lets me know that you can say things in a different way in French or in German than you can in English. And even more so, I would imagine, if you were trying to formulate something in Chinese or in African language or in Native American language. The language would shape how you can talk and how you see. Okay, so there's been a lot today in the science of hermeneutics, and that's all about interpretation. Interpretation of various language and various texts. And that's a little bit of what I did with De Caussade's work, some of the other texts. Because there's what the author intended to write, and then there's the written word, which may or may not fully capture, and probably not fully capture, the totality of the author's intention. And then there's what the reader reads or gets out of it. And anybody that's played that game, you know, where you send something around, you know how things change. And anyone that has given a talk and then had people come up and say, well, you said, and you say, my God, did I say that? You know, that we hear differently. And so there are different, Ricoeur talks about the interpretation of text and what I just said. And Gadamer talks about the different meanings when different horizons meet. And so the written text has a horizon, And then each of the readers has a horizon that they come out of. And a little bit out of, used to be a math teacher, and so, in the olden days. And so Venn diagrams, okay, say this is the horizon of the text. Just a real simple. And this is the horizon of an uneducated person, and this is a horizon of someone with more education, more, maybe more theology. Okay, when they intersect is when the meaning is made. And so if this person intersects with the meaning of the text, you could maybe have something that's filled with meaning. But if this person intersects with the meaning of the text, the meaning is limited. And that is very, very simplified, but that's kind of what I'm talking about. And so when the horizons meet, and that's why I said when Caussade was writing, what writings were really truly his, he was writing to contemplative sisters advanced in the spiritual life. And then what happened was his writings were taken out of their context and given to everybody, some people who read it were like this, and some people who read it are like that. Okay, that's one place where my thinking comes out of and my questions come out of. Another place is psychology today, not so much the depth psychology, but in this instance, particularly adult development. Most of us have heard of Jean Piaget in his studies on the development of children and what children can understand. But there have been further studies in the last 20 or so years about adult development. And we continue to develop in that same way, only on a much higher level. And so adults today, again, here out of their stage of a development. And two authors that I'm talking about are Robert Keegan, who wrote The Evolving Self, and Jane Lovinger, who wrote the book Ego Development, which comes out of an empirical study of thousands of women. Okay. And so they're the main ones that base what I'm talking about. And so in American society today, and I know there are a few people that aren't from the United States, and I apologize, I don't know the statistics about England and Scotland and Ireland and Australia and the Philippines, but in the United States, a great majority of the people are at what these people call the conformist level. This is the normal level, the level the newspapers write to. Okay. And their way of thinking and their ability to think is largely conforming to society. And then people move beyond that into a more self-aware stage. And they begin to ask questions, and they begin to contradict the society in significant ways. And, one of the things that when I look at this particular group of people who have an interest in centering prayer, there's something in you that is different than the majority of people in our society, or you wouldn't be here. Okay? You're asking questions probably aware of yourself, aware of your own needs, aware of God's action in your life. And you have an awareness of the interiority of yourself, not just the exteriority of your life, which comes at a level beyond the conformist stage, that awareness of interiority. And then you move on through more stages, but it's critical that one stage is there, that you become self-aware. Okay. Now, there's differences between men and women and how this happens because of how we're socialized. And I really don't have time to go into all those differences, but they're there in the readings. Okay, so psychology and adult development is another perspective. And again, if we are coming out of a search for truth, then we cannot negate these kinds of modern findings that speak truth. And then the third thing I want to mention is women's studies. And there's lots of areas of women's studies. And because, again, of the time, I'm going to limit it to one thing. And I know this is just a little drop. But there's a book called Women's Ways of Knowing by Mary Field Belenke and a number of other researchers who did empirical work interviewing, again, many women, and then taking their answers and putting them together to how those women answered the questions. And they came up with 5 stages in how women know. The first stage is silence. The second stage is received knowledge. The third is subjective knowledge. The fourth, procedural, and the fifth, constructed. And I'm just going to read a quote from their book that's like a little summary. And these are people from all different levels of society and all different levels of education and poverty and affluence. And okay, the first one is silence. The woman who believes she has nothing to say. Quote, a position in which women experience themselves as mindless and voiceless and subject to the whims of external authority. And this study was done in recent years, in the last 10, 15 years. So we're not talking about way back then, we're talking about now. There are still women who live in that way of knowing. Received knowledge, a perspective from which women conceive of themselves as capable of receiving, even reproducing, knowledge from the all-knowing external authorities, but not capable of creating knowledge on their own. So these are women that have moved to the state where they know they can learn. Subjective knowledge, a perspective from which truth and knowledge are conceived as a personal, private, and subjectively known or intuited. So the person has moved from I can learn from others to I can put things together and know something on my own. Procedural knowledge, a position in which women are invested in learning and applying objective procedures for obtaining and communicating knowledge. This is the more educated. What I said before, we now can go to school, study, learn, use the same tools that are available. And then constructed knowledge, the last one, the highest. A position in which women view all knowledge as contextual. They experience themselves as creators of knowledge and value both the subjective and objective strategies for knowing. So they can learn from others and they can learn from themselves and they can put it together and they can construct their own view of things. Okay. These 5 positions regarding the perceived source of women's knowledge clearly reflect and are coordinated with a progressive growth from lack of self to healthy self-ownership. And that's one of the reasons why the language, not so much that in the quotes I read, but in other parts of the work about self-annihilation, I think are heard very differently by men and by women, depending on where women are and what kind of a sense of self they have. Okay, now going back to De Caussade. There's a difference between reading his work literally, in that, I mean, the way the hermeneutic people talk about literal interpretation, and more contextualized, more critical interpretation, as a person in the conformist stage or below the conformist stage would read it, or whose knowledge style is silence or only receive knowledge is most liable to do, or reading it with discretion. But some of it presents problem even when read with discretion. A significant factor contributing to the problem that it has been lifted into, the writing has been lifted into another century, but especially that it's been made available to a universalized audience. Thus, the normal difficulty of the interpretation of an historical text has been increased by the encouragement to preach this doctrine to all. Now, let me give you a few more examples of the teaching on surrender that need to be listened to carefully. And what might be interesting for you to do with just a little tiny bit of your discussion group would be to share with each other what you heard in these texts. We read, "The mind, with all the consequences of its activity, might take the foremost rank among the tools employed by God, but it has to be deputed to the lowest as a dangerous slave. It might be of great service if made use of in a right manner, but it is a danger if not kept in subjection." And again, "Those who renounce their own will, their own judgment, and their own ideas for the love of God will make great progress in the path of true and solid perfection. Henceforth, do not make any other use of your mind and of your reason than to know what you are ordered to do, and to do it promptly, joyfully, and with great confidence in God, and an absolute abandonment to His mercy." Okay, I think depending on where you are, you hear those words in a different way. You may or may not agree. Regarding obedience, he recommends a childlike blind obedience founded on the principle that God, having authorized His priests to guide us, cannot allow those souls to be deceived who, on this account, abandon themselves blindly to their guidance. Before all things, therefore, make your virtue consist in the renunciation of your own judgment, and in doing all that your director judges before God to be expedient. If you are animated with the spirit of obedience, you will never allow yourself voluntarily to entertain thoughts opposed to what has been enjoined you, and you will take good care not to give in to the inclination to examine and scrutinize everything. Okay, what does this say about adult responsibility coming out of the psychological adult perspective? Okay, and this is not, simply De Caussade. There's stuff like this in the tradition, even if you've never read him. And then, "The snares and subtleties of self-love render you, you say, incapable of seeing things in the proper light. Then why do you attempt to do so? Have you not, in holy obedience, an infallible guide, and in humility and docility, sure guarantees that you are not misled in following the decisions laid down for you? After having consulted your superior or your mistress with the simplicity of a little child, remain in peace, for this is your security. If you do not submit to this rule, you will be much to be pitied, and it will be your own fault." And then a word on the order established by God. Chapter 1 of the Abandonment is summarized in its subtitle, "Sanctity consists in fidelity to the order established by God, and in submission to all His operations." And the order established by God goes along with the duties of one's state in life and all of that. Another quote, "In reality, sanctity can be reduced to one single practice, fidelity to the duties appointed by God. Now, this fidelity is equally within each one's power, whether in its active practice or passive exercise. The active practice of fidelity consists in accomplishing the duties which devolve upon us, whether imposed by the general laws of God and of the Church, or by the particular state that we may have embraced. Its passive exercise consists in the loving acceptance of all that God sends us at each moment. Now, this is an example where there's truth and there's danger. And if you read it literally, you might not see that. There's deep truth, and yet there's a real danger. And then about the order of God. Again, you know, the order of God meant something specific to them. And there's a whole feminist critique of the order of the world. But at the end of it, in the last section of the version that Ramier gives us of the abandonment, he says, in the struggle, the inversion of the order of God, and I'll just read this part. In the struggle between heaven and hell, sin and iniquity are, and this is the quote, the inversion of the order of God. And those who refuse obedience to the order of God are led by Lucifer. Disorder comes from the devil and the beasts from the pit. Quote again, this disorder is a mystery because under a false appearance of good, it hides irremediable and infinite evil. The passage continues. The order of God has ever remained victorious, and those who have ranged themselves on the side of God have shared his triumph and are happy for all eternity. Injustice has never been able to protect deserters. It can reward them only by death, and eternal death. It's pretty strong. Thus, not only is the accepted order of the universe and the known order of society held up as God's order, but the implication that to question it is evil. Okay. Now, after studying the language, the psychology, and a lot of the women in the history of our church, people like Teresa and Catherine, and then studying De Caussade, which was the first book I was given as a profess to read and to base my life upon. And there's a lot of truth in it, but a serious question rose within me, and the question is this. How and why does the lived truth in the lives of women like Catherine and Teresa look like a totally different reality compared with the written tradition of surrender and the less good parts of the written tradition of surrender? Okay. And again, this is going to be a real brief answer. I think one reason is the traditional writing is done by men. And our sins and our challenges as men and women, I think, are different. For I think, and I might be wrong, but from the reading, this is what I glean. For men, surrender is to give up power, to let God in. Because they are the ones in the society that this was written in that had the power. And to let their ego deflate a little bit. And to really move into discernment. To choose what God asks rather than from their own self and their own desires. And and it seems that this is attested by the written exhortations to surrender, that it's this kind of a thing. However, given the societal place of women, for the most part, and I think we can see that Teresa even dealt with this, to really surrender to God is not emphasizing what William, I think, was calling a worm theology, but is to resist cultural forces as they listen to God within. And so sometimes that means saying no. It certainly means thinking. I think that for them to surrender to God, they have to move from that place of silence and not valuing themselves. Women are taught from most of us are taught from the time we're little to really pay attention to everybody else's needs and wants and what's going on, and to be really perceptive of the whole situation in order to survive. And so the socialization, and men are, I even look at my brother, he was taught to get out there and do it and make it and be a success. And even I was taught, I was to be some man's support. I didn't quite do what was expected of me and my family, but that's the way I was raised. And so the sociological conditioning has a lot to do with this. And so for a woman, I think even the word surrender sometimes is problematical. Not always, but sometimes, depending on the history. And so they need to be taught to claim themselves and encouraged to value themselves. Rahner talks about the human being as the capacity for God. I think that's a beautiful way of looking at the human being. This creation of God that God wants to gift with God's self. And what is the proper response to that? The gift of oneself back to God, I think. But if you have no value of yourself, are you going to want to give that self back to God? There's going to be a lot of tussles and interior problems with that whole thing. It's when you can finally value yourself and give yourself back to God that you can really surrender. Okay. And so I think that we need to grow and become the self that God made us, men and women, and that God wants us to be, and then to give that self back to God in surrender, in action, in love, in service to our neighbor. And I think that's what we saw in Catherine and Teresa. Both of them had turning points in their lives. Catherine was told by Jesus to leave her cell or he was going to go away and get out there and be with his people. And Teresa struggled for years. And I think part of that struggle, and there's a whole work written about it, was in that self-appropriation of really the gifts that she was given and that she better get out there and use them. Thank you.